Hey guys, before we get started with our tutorial today, I just want to mention that we are hosting a contest over on my Discord. So if you're interested in winning some awesome prizes, make sure to go join that. Link is in the description below. Anyways, today I wanted to talk about camera tracking and kind of all the steps that you can do to improve your camera tracking and everything. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, if you want to follow along with us, the download links for all the footage I use in this tutorial are in the description below, so make sure to go download that. First of all, inside of Blender, we're going to come up here, then go to the VFX Motion Tracking tab. When we're here, we can actually go ahead and open up our footage. So this is the first clip I'm going to open, this Motion Tracking M4V. So just open that up. You should see this. Now, whenever you're camera tracking, you always want to make sure that you're working in the standard color space. So let's come up to the render properties, color management, and make sure it's set on standard. Now, you might recognize this footage from another tutorial series, and I just kind of wanted to do this because this is the most basic camera tracking you can do. So first of all, we're going to do some settings over here. First of all, we want to make sure that match is on previous frame. Previous frame always just works better for me, improves my tracking a lot, so I'd highly recommend just setting that for all the camera tracking you do. Also, another thing I do for most of my camera tracking is set this to normalize. This basically just makes the lighting of the scene kind of flat and stuff, which lets Blender actually camera track it a little bit easier. And the final thing that I do for most of my camera tracking is come down here to the tracking settings extra and then set this correlation to a 0.9. This basically means that Blender has to be 90% sure that the camera track is correct for it to continue tracking, whereas before it'll set on 75%. Okay, so with that now out of the way, we can go ahead and look up at this default scene. First of all, we have a 3D viewport up here. We have the camera tracking tab over here, and then down here is our timeline, and it's actually set to a tracking only timeline. So this will give us some extra data that we can work with. So to actually create our tracking marker, we're going to hit Control and then click wherever we want to create our tracking marker. And you can see that that's actually created one. Let's hit Alt S to actually reveal the search area. Basically, the search area is where Blender is going to look for this little box between frames. So if I go one frame after, you'll see that the frame has moved. And basically, you want to set this as small as you can, get away with and stuff, but you don't want it to be too big because Blender will take forever to actually motion track and everything. Now, you can actually change these for each individual one, or you can set it for all the ones that you place by coming over to here to the pattern size and search size. So let's just say I increase both of these. We can now see that when I place a tracking marker down, both of those have increased. Okay, so now let's actually start adding our tracking markers. So we want to come over here to this dot. We're going to hold Control, then click. And we'll notice that it's a little small, so let's come over here. Let's Control Z to undo that. Then increase the pattern size and also the search size just a little bit. And now when we click, we should see that it's bigger and kind of what we want. If you basically just want to play around with that whenever you're doing tracking to get the size and search size that you want. Next, we can actually come over to this little tracking window over here to this. And this is basically just a area where you can move around the tracking marker and everything. So if I place another one down, we can see that. And we can move it around over here just to make it a little more precise of where the actual marker is going to be. Now, some shortcuts I like to use. First of all, again, Alt S is the search area. So if you want to hide or unhide that, usually I'll enable it when I first place in my actual tracking markers, then disable it once I know that the search size and everything is what I want, just to free up some clutter in the actual viewport. So the next shortcut I like is L. L will basically lock this tracking marker to the center of the screen so we can actually view it easy. So if I have a tracking marker selected and press L, we can now lock it in place. And now if I hold Control T to track, it actually remains in the center of the screen. Okay, let's just undo that real quick. Again, you want to make sure that you are on the first keyframe. Okay, so now let's just Control click all these. I still have the locked feature on, so let's just press L again to unhide that. Then we can now just click all these dots basically. They don't have to be too perfect since the way I shot this is pretty basic. Not a lot of camera movement and everything. So once we have that, we can go ahead and hit A to select all these. And then if you're on the first keyframe, you can hold Control and T, and that'll start tracking the markers. Okay, so now you can see once we have started tracking, there will be all these lines down here. Basically, you're just looking for any line that kind of goes haywire. So, for example, this would be one that kind of goes a little bit haywire compared to the other one of the lines and stuff. But if I undo that real quick, you can see that none of my lines actually have that, so we're all good. Now let's just bring this down. You will notice that all my tracking markers made it throughout the scene, so that's very nice. Let's go ahead and solve the camera motion so we can actually import in our 3D objects. So let's come to solve. First option, if you're on a tripod, you want to select this. I'm not, so we don't want to select that. Next is keyframe. Basically, keyframe will select this A and B keyframe, and that's kind of the threshold of where Blender will look for the solve to actually calculate the solve and everything. So usually I like to keyframe it first, and then see what values it gives me, and then usually I like to refine that a little bit manually, but we can get into that a little bit later. Let's go ahead and just select that just for this first basic one, and then we're going to refine the focal length K1 and K2. This is basically Blender just trying to recreate your camera, kind of the focal length and the optical sensor that you're using in your camera, so it just tries to recreate that. And then finally we can just come down here and hit the solve camera motion. Okay, so once your solve has finished, you'll see it right here. I got a solve error of a 0.27, and that's actually really good. You want to try to get that as low as possible. I recommend anything between a 0.5 and lower. Sometimes if I need a really good track, I'll try to push that down to a 0.2 or lower or anything like that, but for the sake of this tutorial, that is all good. Okay, so now we're actually ready to set up our tracking scene. Let's come over here and then set up our tracking scene. And you'll notice up here that it's set a couple of values. If we actually zoom around out here, you will notice that we have these little dots right here. And those dots actually correspond to our tracking markers. You will know that our plane and everything is not on those dots. So if we come out here and then kind of just scrub through the timeline down here, you should see that the plane isn't really sticking to where we want it to. So to change that, we're going to actually come back to our first keyframe right here. And then we're going to select 3 points. So I'm going to select this one, and this one. You want to make sure those are as 90 degrees as possible to each other, trying to form a right triangle like that. It doesn't have to be, but usually that works the best for creating your floor. Let's just come over here and create our floor real quick. You should see that it's kind of set it on our floor, but now we can't really see the whole scene or whatever. So we need to select, let's just select these two, and then come down here and set the scale. And then you could just open up this little menu and play around with the scale until you get something that you like. I'm going to leave it like that. So now if we actually scroll throughout our scene, we should see that it does in fact stick to our table and it's correctly motion tracked now. Now you can do other stuff with your scene, like selecting the origin or the X and Y axis. To do those, you just want to select a point, then set origin, and then you can select another point and set the Y or X axis. This is just an easy way to kind of orientate your scene a little bit. But now we're ready to actually move on to the other steps. So those other steps to actually get a good composite and everything, we're going to come to the layout tab so we can see what we have a little bit easier. So if we want to see those points where our actual tracking markers are, we can come up to here, then go to motion tracking, and you can also enable your camera path if you're interested in that. That kind of just lets you see where the actual camera moves. So we now have our actual points down here. You can see that these are kind of empties and stuff that we can play around with. This is set up to be a shadow catcher. This is basically that floor that we set up earlier. It's just a plane on that floor. So that basically just defines where our ground is in the scene in case we need to orientate or put any 3D objects on the floor. So now if we just come and select this cube, then hit G, Z, and then I'm going to hold Control and snap it up 1. So that is looking good. We can now see our cube is on the floor, but if we go into the camera and go into render view, you'll see a couple of problems. Number one, we can't actually see the shadow. We're going to go ahead and delete this background collection. We don't really need that, and put the ground in the foreground collection. And now you can see the shadow and the plane and everything. Now this object is set up to be a shadow catcher by default, but for some reason we don't really see that. We can actually see the diffusion of the plane. So to change that, we're going to come to the render properties, go to the cycles render engine. I'm just going to switch it to GPU compute right now. And then we can still see that it's a gray mess, and that's actually because the world is a gray void right now. So if we want to set the film, we're going to make the film transparent. So now you can see this is the result that we want. We have our shadow with some transparency and everything, along with our cube and everything, so that is looking good. The final thing that we have to do to get a good composite is to come over here. Then we can just delete some of these nodes that Blender automatically set up. These 3 nodes we don't really need, and this node is the background view layer, which we're not going to really use. So let's just go ahead and plug the movie clip into this image socket. And then we can go ahead and convert to pre-multiply. That basically just makes the alpha channels a little bit nicer. And then the final thing that we need to do is, since we deleted our background view layer, we don't really need that anymore. So let's just come up to this. This is background view layer, and then we just need to exit out of that. Okay, so here's the final composite. If you want to just check that over, this is just for basic level compositing. So now if we go ahead and render out an image, you should see that we now have the correct shadow and diffuse and everything's looking good. So now we're actually ready to move on to our another example. Okay, so I just opened a new Blender project. We're going to again come to VFX motion tracking, then open up our footage. So for this one, I'm just going to open up this video.mp4. So we have this, and then again, just make sure you're on the standard view transform. And then again, just to remind you guys, I'm going to set it to previous frame, normalize, and then in the tracking settings extra, make the correlation to a 0.9. Now this shot is really easy because it gives us a lot of points that we can actually use. When you want to select points, you want to look for areas of high contrast. So a lot of these areas like this would be a good point for us to select and everything. So let's just basically come out here and select all the points that kind of stand out to you, because Blender will find points like that easier to track and everything. So basically just select as many points as you can. For this specific shot, you can't really go wrong with any of the points you select, just because there are so many and they are so detailed and everything. So I'm just selecting a bunch of points that kind of stand out to me. You want to try to get as many as possible. Don't go too crazy with it though, just because you don't want to have all this mess and everything. So again, just hold Control and click. We're just clicking at areas that stand out to us. So yeah, just continue to do this, and I'll come back when I finish mine. Okay guys, so I've just finished setting up all my trackers. One quick thing to note is the position of all my trackers and stuff. You'll see that I have some trackers that are closer to the camera, such as these, and then some trackers are further away from the camera. And this is actually what we want, because that's how Blender actually uses the information that it's given to actually give us a solve and camera track and everything. It's called parallaxing. Basically, the points in the distance move slower than points closer to the camera, and so with that data, Blender can actually use that to calculate where the object would be in 3D space. So with all that said, basically that means that we want objects that are closer, like this mountain right here, than objects further in the distance, just to get that variation. Also, we want some variation on where the markers are placed on the screen. So we want some on the left side over here, and then also on the right side, just trying to fill out as much area as possible. Okay, so now that we have that, before we actually track it, one thing that is very nice is to actually go ahead and prefetch the footage. This basically just bakes all the frames of the video into the video memory. This just makes the playback very smooth, because if I kind of scrub throughout here, you'll notice that it's very choppy, and we don't really want that. And it'll also make for a faster track, so let's come up here and prefetch the footage. Okay, you'll notice it's done prefetching when this little bar down here turns blue, and now if we scrub throughout here, we have very smooth playback. So now let's come down here to the first keyframe where we are at, and then hold Control and press T. Okay, so my shot just finished tracking. We can see all the lines down here look pretty nice and everything. So now let's go ahead and solve the camera motion. We're going to come up to here, and then instead of hitting this keyframe for this, we're actually going to select our keyframes manually. So when you're looking to select your A and B keyframe, you want to look at areas that have a lot of parallax and stuff. I think that helps is actually looking at these lines. You'll notice that the lines that are longer are moving a bit faster than, let's say, these lines back here, which are a lot smaller, which are moving a lot slower. So basically, you just want to find an area where there are lots of longer lines and smaller lines. So I'm going to start mine at 40 right here. And then let's just go out. You also want a pretty decent time frame of where these are. So I'm just going to go, let's say, to 120. Let's see if that works for us. We can always change it in the future if we don't get a good solve error. So again, refine the K1 and K2 and focal length, and then solve the camera motion. Okay, so we are able to get our solve error down to a 0.4, which is really nice. We can get that lower, however. So let's come over here to this cleanup section. We're actually going to clean up some of the tracks. This basically just takes the solve error of each individual track and detects it, and if we move this reprojection error up, it'll basically select all the points that has a higher solve error than what the number we set it at. So let's just scroll it up until we get a few, I say like 4 or 5, and then we just wanted to delete those tracks. And now we just want to solve the camera motion again. Now you can see that we got our solve error to a 0.35, so that's really nice. Let's go ahead and clean up the tracks just one more time to see if we can get it any lower. I'm just going to select that and then delete those and solve the camera issue. Okay, we were able to get our solve error down to a 0.3, which is really good. I'm not going to really mess around with this anymore, but if you're doing something intensive, you want to make sure that's as low as possible. So again, just to quickly go through the setup for actually tracking scene, we're going to set up the tracking scene right here. Usually takes a bit. We have all our points and stuff up here. We need to define our floor area, and I actually don't have a good place for my floor. So what you can do is actually come to the start keyframe, and we can notice that these are kind of on the floor right here, but we don't have one around this area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a point here and a point right here, because again that kind of makes the 90-degree angle. Let's just move that right there. So the 90-degree angle on the floor. Then we can just select these two and hit Control-T to track that. And that'll track throughout the footage and everything. And then once that reaches the end, we need to solve the camera motion again. We shouldn't get a crazy solve error that's different from our other one. It actually went down for me, so that's pretty funny. So now we just want to select all these 3 points, then hit the floor button right here, and that actually sets up our floor to be nice and level with the actual ground of our scene. Let's set the scale again, so select 2 points. I'm just going to select these two, set scale, and then just play around with this value until I get something I like. Now let's come and set our origin. So our origin I'm going to set here, and then the y-axis I want to set to be here, just so it's in line with the bridge a little bit better. So now we should be ready to go into layout mode, to the camera, and then let's just play around with this a little bit. We're not going to actually render this out, but I just kind of wanted to show you what it looks like. So I'm just going to scale this down and then hit Shift Z to move it on every axis but the Z axis. And you can see if I move it throughout here, it kind of follows the bridge very nicely. So that's how you know your actual tracking is set up correctly and everything. I'll go ahead and make a little scene for you guys just so you can see that it's tracked correctly. So that's hopefully playing on the screen right now. Okay, so on to our final shot of the day. This is a little more advanced, so let's go ahead and get started by coming up to VFX Motion Tracking. Again, open our clip. So this is a clip I'm going to open. Let's just go ahead and open that up. Now let's just go ahead and go to the standard color space. Again, just do our settings over here. Normalize 0.9. Now one thing I forgot to mention earlier is that we can actually set the scene frames of our actual footage, and I'm not going to do that for this tutorial, but if you wanted to actually go ahead and set the frames to be the length of your full clip, you can go ahead and do that, but we're just going to go ahead and prefetch the footage. Okay, so now that we have that finished, we can go ahead and come, instead of playing around with all of these settings down here and then adding our own individual markers, we can actually go ahead and have Blender automatically detect some features of the clip. So let's hit this detect features button. You'll notice that a lot of tracking markers actually pop up on the screen. Now, depending on your footage, you might not get as many tracking markers and everything. But I got a decent amount, so I'm going to leave these settings alone. But for if any reason you want to add more tracking markers to your scene, you want to try to get as many as possible for this step. So you can play around with the threshold and the distance just to add a little bit more tracking markers to your scene. But let's go ahead and click out of that. Now we have all of these selected. We can just go ahead and hit Control-N-T and it should track forward. Okay, so my tracking just finished. We can kind of scrub throughout here to see what happened. And as you can see, you can kind of see that parallax that we were talking about before. These markers right here are traveling a lot faster because they are closer to the camera. Whereas these markers in the distance aren't traveling that much because they're further away from the camera. So that is looking pretty good. We'll notice down here there are no anomalies or anything, like I said earlier. So that is all looking good. Now we actually need to solve the camera motion again. So again, we're just going to select our own A and B keyframe. So I'm going to start mine, let's say at 15. And then let's scrub throughout here. Let's go to 120. I think that'll give us a pretty large gap where we can play around with and set this, then solve our camera motion. Okay, so I was able to get my solve error to a 1.97, so that's looking good. Again, we just need to clean up those keyframes to get that as low as possible. So let's just clean the tracks. Actually, we need to deselect all these first and then clean the tracks. So let's just set the reproduction error up like that, then just delete those tracks and solve our camera motion again. Okay, so that automatically brought it down to a 0.87. So we just want to keep doing that until we get a solve error that we want. Okay, so I was able to get my solve error down to a 0.42. If I was actually trying to do this for real, for my actual VFX shot and stuff, I would probably add a little bit more markers and try to get this solve error down to something like a 0.2 or something. but for this tutorial, this is all I need. You will notice that we have a bunch of red dots around, and that's actually because our tracking markers are getting lost. If Blender loses the tracking marker, it'll turn red and stop tracking the actual marker and everything. If we want to kind of free up some clutter on our screen, we can actually hold Alt and D to hide those markers, and that basically just hides the untracked markers and only leaves the track markers during a specific moment in time. Okay, so now that we have our markers like that, we can use our same workflow that we've been doing before to set up the tracking scene and everything. So let's set up the tracking scene down here. Okay, so now let's actually orientate our scene. I'm going to come down here, find 3 points that make that 90-degree kind of floor-like pattern that we had before. So I'm going to select this one, let's see, this one, and this one to be my floor. It's just going to select the floor right here, and we should notice that it looks about right. Let's zoom out a bit. Or in fact, set the scale, just play around with that a little bit more. Yeah, so that looks a bit better. Let's set this to be the origin. And then for our x-axis, we're going to make this our x, just orientate that a little bit better. So now if I come to the layout tab, go into the camera, we should now see that we have a better orientation of our scene. It's not perfect, so if you wanted to play around and add some points to make a floor, then I'd recommend doing that, but this is pretty good for what we need it for. And then for one final time, we're just going to set up our actual compositing and everything, so let's delete this. We're going to come up here, select this background view layer, delete that, and come in the compositing, we're just going to delete all these, plug the movie clip into the image, convert pre-multiply. Then we need to come to the render properties, set this to cycles, GPU compute if you have it, and then finally set the film to transparent. Now if we actually go into the rendered mode, we can see that we have everything set up correctly and everything's looking good. You can of course play around with the lighting and everything to get what you want. So let's say if I just wanted to add in a mesh, let's do the monkey, because why not? We can play around with that just a little bit. But you will see that it looks like it's floating right now, and that's just one thing you always want to make sure of in your actual scene. If you want stuff to float, you want it above this kind of ground plane, so we can see that our ground plane is here and our monkey really isn't attached to it. But if you wanted our monkey to actually stay on the ground and not look like it's floating or whatever, you could just go to the side view and make sure that the monkey is actually on the ground and stuff like that. You can see if I go into wireframe mode, you'll see this line, this is our ground. Just make sure the monkey is resting right on that and not really going through it. So now if I view this, it'll look like it's on the ground a little bit better. There's an animation on the screen right now showing our actual camera tracking. Okay guys, so that is my full camera tracking tutorial. Now this was a very easy camera tracking tutorial. Again, there are many ways to actually camera track your footage and everything. No one way is the best, so whatever footage you're working on, you might find that one way works better than the other. But I kind of just wanted to give you all the tips and tricks I've learned over the years of camera tracking. Anyways guys, thank you guys so much for watching. Again, we have a Patreon and Discord. Links to those are in the description below. We also have a contest on Discord, so if you're interested in joining that, make sure to join our Discord. But anyways guys, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys later. Peace.